David Alfaro Siqueiros. So he's the youngest of the three muralists we've looked at or will be looking at. And you can see that here. He's born in 1896 and dies in 1974. So pretty recent. I'd say that brings him right up to, almost not quite the present day, but certainly someone who we still might remember from the present day. And his life spans or extends into the Cold War, well into the Cold War, well after World War II. I think the two artists we've seen so far, or three if you include Frida Kahlo, they 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 occupy an earlier part of the century that consists of World War One, World War Two, but don't their career doesn't go well beyond World War Two. But I think Siqueiros is the exception because he's a little younger. And I think you'll discover he's the most radical of the three, the most politically active in the sense that he gets thrown in jail multiple times. So he has multiple mugshots, which I think only enhances radical bona fides. And he's also someone who, like for instance, he participates in the assassination of Leon Trotsky. I have a few questions I still haven't answered about him that I'd like to answer more, and that could be something you could tackle if any of you decide to write about him. Namely, what the final stage of his relationship with Diego Rivera, in terms of this assassination attempt against Leon Trotsky, who, as you remember, was a friend of Diego Rivera's and uh, Frida Kahlo. So, in addition to his radical quality, he's very politically active, and I think because of the Cold War context, he's a little more of like a kind of like a Che Guevara before Che Guevara, with minus the um, focus on being a soldier. Though you'll see today that Siqueiros served in the Spanish Civil War, and I think you would say, and during this Mexican Revolution as well. So he's very, very politically active, very politically involved, and I think you'll see his artwork generates a lot of controversy as a result. But I think you can understand his heightened sense of politics because he is one younger than the other two, and maybe his life uh, corresponds more to some other major political events in the 20th century, like the Cold War, and or maybe he's just sort of trying to leave his mark. It's hard in the wake of these two major muralists. It's as the phrase goes, someone is a hard act to follow. I think Diego Rivera and Orozco would be a hard act to follow because they set the bar so high. We'll be seeing this mural later today. This is one of the important murals he makes in the United States called America Tropical, and it gets him into a little bit of controversy in the United States. So here he is, and I think this is one of his dynamic poses. We see this again later on in his career becomes almost a parallel to Lady Liberty holding the flag in the French Revolution. We've seen this from Orozco with the raised hand of the indigenous Aztecs in his Dartmouth mural. And I think Siqueiros takes some of the iconography um, from either revolutionary paintings or even some iconography from his fellow Mexican muralists and runs with it. And I think it's up for you to decide. For me, it's an interesting puzzle to fit Siqueiros into the other two muralists, both in terms of the influence, the cross pollination between them, and also what his unique contribution is. One thing you might consider is he could be a bridge in between the two others, Rivera and Orozco. I find his work to have some elements of Rivera, all in a positive sense, and some elements of Orozco. And also, he's doing his own thing, especially in terms of experimenting with different techniques like stenciling, airbrush, spray paint, and all of this leads to him having a positive impact on artists in the United States, perhaps ironically on Jackson Pollock, who's already been cross-pollinated by Orozco, and this might be the last Mexican ingredient, to fully make Jackson Pollock become the Jackson Pollock figure that is so important to abstract expressionism. So, in terms of cross-pollination, we have another major figure influencing the art world, even if it's indirectly or inadvertent. There's no denying that he has a major impact on Jackson Pollock, as we'll see today. So here's a self-portrait. And well, we'll see a lot of photographs of him and a few portraits. Um, I'd like to get right into his life, and we can revisit some pictures similar to this one. But I think you will see this is a motif in his pictures: the fist raised out, almost reaching out of the canvas at the viewer, and a very sort of kind of moment of empowerment or defiance. So, like I said, his career, he's a little younger. And so you have to sort of take everything we've looked at, that sort of looping history we've seen, starting from maybe the Mexican Revolution all the way up to World War II, and maybe shift that just a little further ahead so that it overlaps with the Cold War. And so everything about Siqueiros begins a little later. So his involvement with the other Mexican muralists begins in the same location in Mexico City, uh, right after the revolution, but he's a little younger. And so he's got a different thing to contribute to this vibrant scene of Mexican muralism, which is not to say he's so unlike the other two, because he also travels to the United States, as we'll see, as part of this good neighbor policy. So here's the Mexican Revolution again in 1914, and the key slogan was Tierra y Libertad, just to remind you. And here's Zapata and Pancho Villa, the very sitting in Mexico City at the peak moment of the Mexican Revolution. Very eventful decade with this going on, World War I going on, and the Russian Soviet Revolution going on. Here's Lenin. So very eventful, and I think Siqueiros is all the more marked by these major events, possibly because he's a younger man and maybe more idealistic and or more politically animated, because his coming of age coincides with these major upheavals in politics and society. And here you can see the him trying to impress the two older muralists who are looking at Siqueiros a little bit like, who's this young guy? I like him. I think I like Orozco's expression. You rarely see Orozco crack a smile or do anything more than kind of stare into the distance in a lot of photographs. But I like that both Rivera and Orozco are giving you this almost cheeky response to Siqueiros, who is probably telling them about painting techniques he has, or his plans to assassinate world leaders. And I'm of course speculating, but I think you can appreciate he's a younger guy. But I love that they're all dressed in these suit and ties, and this formal quality to revolution that is so notable about Siqueiros. And yeah, they clearly have a bond between with the three of them. And I think Siqueiros is probably seen as someone they mentor, especially Rivera and Siqueiros, because Siqueiros was studying at the Prepa in Mexico City when Diego Rivera was teaching there. So I think he identifies Siqueiros as a kindred spirit, a kindred communist sympathizer. And when Diego Rivera was appointed to be the head of the school there, he initiated a lot of radical changes that ended up getting him, I think, if I remember, ousted eventually, although he kept getting commissions. This is a similar story to the others, and I think it has more to do with the ongoing trouble with being outspoken about one's communism in this era of American efforts to stifle communism in Mexico. Because remember, the United States doesn't want anything trickling into the United States, anything trickling into the Panama Canal, and we don't want any communist revolution at our doorstep. And this should definitely raise, I think Siqueiros will raise more alarms about that, because he is so outspoken and so radical. So something to consider today is how the United States addresses Siqueiros, his politics, and likewise how Mexico respond to his politics. And like I said earlier, he embraces airbrush, spray paint, and other techniques, and to great success, to great, I guess, yeah, with a unique contribution because of these sort of this experimentation. You probably, yeah, I don't think you see much experimentation with Diego Rivera. I think his major sort of thesis was, what if I take Italian frescoes and make those relevant in modern Mexico as a way to tell the story of Mexico and create a more inclusive Mexican history through fresco making. especially for the illiterate. And I think that's kind of the thesis for Siqueiros to a degree, because they were both in Mexico. I mean, they were both in Paris, in Europe at the same time, exploring these Italian frescoes. But I think you'll see that something about Siqueiros shifts him away from um, Diego Rivera's path. And one thing, before they split away, they of course have this sort of common thread, which is this gentleman we've seen before, Dr. Adel, who is one of the key, I guess, key proponents of this idea of using art to create this Mexicanidad, this Mexican sense of artistry coming out of the Mexican Revolution. And the title of the book that you guys are reading for this class, Vida Americana, I think comes from this manifesto that Siqueiros writes about. I guess one of the main ideas is sort of this mestiza art, or kind of an art fitting for the new world. And also, I think you could see the manifesto about art being a kind of rehearsal or mirror of the, of his manifestations, political manifestations. So sort of the upheaval in art mirrors the upheaval in politics. So a new American generation. Let's abandon literary motives. Let's make a pure plastic. Plastic in Spanish is more sort of tangible rather than literally plastic. The preponderance of constructive spirit about the decorative spirit, analytical spirit, prejudicial influences and new tendencies. So I think he's just sort of speaking generally about this sort of about the possibilities of a new art form. But I think this is probably where the book got its name from, by citing the Vida Americana. And it wasn't a manifesto that got a lot of traction the way maybe the Communist Manifesto did, but it sets the stage for how politically active, and how Siqueiros really can't separate or doesn't separate art from politics. Here he is with Diego Rivera, presumably in France, I don't know for sure. And his activity in the Vanguardia and this publication they make called the Machete gets him in trouble at the prepa where they're teaching, he and Diego Rivera. And you can see some of Siqueiros' style here on the right. This figure here is a Siqueiros picture, and you could see that in one of his early murals that he makes. And this mural was destroyed. Right now, I think only a remainder of it survives. Thea, I'm just adding you to the group. And if you're joining a little late, make sure you stick around at the end of class to hear anything you might have missed. So the burial of a worker, and the title itself hints at his proletarian sympathies. And this mural was whitewashed, erased, if I remember correctly, because of his outspoken communist views. This is a time when in Mexico, I think they outlawed the Communist Party. So the reason why you'll find a lot of his work ends up being either destroyed or whitewashed, for the same reason Diego Rivera's work was destroyed, because he's sympathizing with communism quite a bit. That said, you notice also this bright, almost indigo blue and that red. And I really think you see this again, this fascinating color motif in this era, which is sort of this blue and red combination, which is so rich and almost like this sort of magical recipe formula for some of these muralists, including Thomas Hart Benton. So that's something to revisit today. This sort of the appearance of red and blue as a sort of visual solution to some of the challenges of a mural and whatever that might solve. And I think you see that gentleman's face there looks very similar to, you can recognize the style of Siqueiros here. Here, of course, you can see the star too on the upper left above this guy's shoulder. There it is on the other side, the opposite side. And I again want to remind you, he's a very interesting, Siqueiros is a very interesting bridge to Cuba. As we'll see, he actually does travel to Cuba and is almost like a Che Guevara figure. His scope is much more broad than just one country. And so Siqueiros is almost like a harbinger of Che Guevara and this sort of international scope of Latin American revolution during the Cold War. So Vasconcelos is the Minister of Education, who on one hand unites all these muralists. On the other hand, I think he's he's got his institutional obligations, and Siqueiros especially, but probably Rivera too, are too politically incendiary, and they give Siqueiros or Vasconcelos gives uh, Siqueiros an ultimatum: keep working for the machete or keep working for us. And Siqueiros chooses to quit his job. He's a purist politically, and this is around the time he meets Eisenstein, whose work we saw a while back. If you remember, he's the Soviet filmmaker who comes to Mexico to film, and he wasn't as relevant in terms of Rivera and Orozco, not totally irrelevant, but more relevant to Siqueiros because he's, again, a little younger. So this corresponds or coincides with Siqueiros's coming of age or rise into adulthood. And you'll see the impact of, I think, these stunning Soviet filmmakers filming of Cuba, these stunning pictures we've seen from maybe an outsider's view of Mexico. And some of them, I think, literally inspire some of Siqueiros's paintings. Something about, the Soviets' vision of Mexico inspires Siqueiros. And also maybe it's the idea of using film and crystallizing a political vision through film. This film is a whole another animal. We could talk about how you use composition in film and things like that. I think you can see how Eisenstein is cross-pollinating with Siqueiros here, and they find a common bridge with politics, with communism. And we'll return to this mural a little later. I think you can see that influence here, almost like a still from, maybe not a still exact translation from the movie, but some of these, especially the angle. Remember, we looked at Rivera's paintings, and a lot of it comes from this sort of straight on angle, looking up perhaps at the subjects, crowding out the murals. In the case of Siqueiros, it seems like he's taking more of a bird's eye view, looking down, so that we can see more of the faces and feel the sense of infinity of all these repeating hats and sombreros and figures that fade away into infinity. So just the point of view feels like maybe that's kind of draws inspiration from Eisenstein, trying to fit all these different elements into a maybe more rich composition. Definitely those hats, this sort of this repeating distinctly Mexican element. So we'll return to those, that mural later, and I think you'll find this one of the crown jewels of his career. So his activity with the Communist Party leads him to get jailed, excommunicated. That's a funny word, excommunicated. Usually that refers to religion, but excommunicated from Mexico. So sort of he becomes a pariah, a persona non grata, and he takes the message and goes to the United States. I don't think it's fascinating that the United States is a place of exile for a lot of political refugees in the 20th century. I think we might expect the United States to be sort of not that. But I'm sure the opposite is true. There's cases where people flee the United States and go to other countries. I can't say any right off the top of my head, but certainly Siqueiros is another example of like a Jose Marti, who maybe even a Che Guevara, addressing the United Nations, talking about criticizing the United States. And I do think, here Siqueiros will travel to the United States under the good graces of whoever's commissioning him, and he'll stick his thumb in the eye of the United States because as a good communist, he has to be critical of the sort of corporate overlords. And probably some of this is him understanding that he and the other Mexican muralists are part of this bigger agenda by the United States to create good neighbors with Mexico, but it's also serving the United States interest to gobble up all the oil from Mexico, or to just sort of keep communism at bay. So this game of cat and mouse continues, especially with Siqueiros. And I think Siqueiros is much more aggressive, much bolder than perhaps the other two, as far as really pushing those communists and or criticizing the United States. And at the same time, they're all working in the United States, probably trying to compete with each other for being, for leaving their mark in the United States. And probably in the case of Siqueiros, being the younger of the three, he wants to impress the other two and show that he's, worthy and equal. Who knows? That might not be true, but I would imagine we can infer something like that, some kind of rivalry. And here's one of his early murals in the United States. So he's exiled from Mexico, where he's uh, not welcome there for now, temporarily. And you will appreciate there's something distinct and wonderful about his style. I think it's evolving still, but there's something almost really innately talented about Siqueiros, especially the dynamic colors and things pop off the canvas in a wonderful way. And I think he's still discovering kind of either what he wants to say about the United States. I think he's maybe adding some sense of racial inclusivity here, but focusing on the workers. They're sitting on like a construction scaffold, looking down at someone who's maybe giving a political speech. So that's cool. And I think you'll find, at least I think, Siqueiros is a lot more emotional and dynamic than Rivera. And I think, yeah, and I think he does so in a unique way that doesn't resemble Orozco. Uh, but I think he also experiments so much that you'll see a very wide range of him trying to find his style, and it makes him more a little. It's the spaces he puts murals in are a little more dynamic, and I think he's a little more. His work is more updated for more contemporary world with things like airbrush and spray paint. Really, I think possibly, well, let me say, I have argued in the past in my other class that Siqueiros might be someone who is a progenitor or early contributor to spray paint and graffiti art. You'll see that in a moment. And that's another research question I'd like to investigate a little further. So I think this painting he does in Los Angeles might address the quote you just saw with him trying to avoid cliches, quote unquote, of primitivism and Indianismo. And now that could relate back to Diego Rivera. Maybe it could relate back to not Diego Rivera, but just maybe an awakening interest in Aztec or Maya culture, but in a very bourgeois, superficial kind of way. And maybe that's what all these Mexican muralists are trying to do: celebrate Mexican roots without making it sort of like a cliche or some kind of talisman of Mexican identity. So that could be what he's doing here in this mural, trying to, because he is in the United States visualizing Mexico, and that's probably going to make anything cliche all the more cliche. So that could be one of his guiding themes here, guiding motives, is to visualize Mexico in a way that's not pandering or diminishing, denigrating to Mexico, either visually or in terms of content. So let's maybe take a little more time on this one and think about what's going on. First off, just from this point of view, you notice this is probably a panoramic camera that's trying to tackle these two extreme ends of this mural, which is probably so long. That's why it looks distorted, just because it's a panoramic lens. What do you notice about his style? What stands out immediately about, or anything stand out about Siqueiros in contrast to Rivera or Orozco? When we look at this picture of portrait of Mexico today, it's pretty ambitious subject.
I think his way of like drawing characters in spaces is kind of like he like, blows them up in some ways. Like they kind of fill the area a lot, as opposed to like I think Orozco does a similar thing in the way that he kind of makes these characters much larger in scale. But I think here Siqueiros does more. He just makes them much more larger and much more important in the frame, especially like with all the different structural elements as well, like the pillars. Everything feels very like expanded. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I think he's opening up the space. If you think about, compared to Rivera, his pictures are all completely filled with people. This is almost like a commentary. You could see this almost as a commentary on Diego Rivera. Like there's nobody, there's very few people, and that's fine. So I think for me, it's almost funny to think about. He is working in the wake of Rivera and Orozco, and you have to consider how those artists are influencing Siqueiros, who doesn't want to resemble the two of them. He wants to make murals that are unique, while making you murals that are good. You know? So you could look at his work in terms of the parameters of the mural, but also in terms of how does he make his murals look different than the other two. And yeah, you mentioned those two columns. Those are really easy to overlook, and yet there's such a big, bold use of that much space in the canvas to create this almost illusion like you're under kind of a plaza or under some kind of um, roof, and you're looking out onto a pyramid with these figures looking right out back at you. So it's this almost like you're looking through a looking glass at Mexico here, while Mexico is looking through a looking glass at you. And Alyssa says, less people. Yeah, Diego Rivera seemed to fill this bit, yeah, to the brim with people. Yeah, why and why do you think he did that, Alyssa? What was the what no, motivated? And remember, he kept doing it. So was it people telling him, "Oh, this is so great, keep and that made him want to keep doing it, or was it he trying to be kind of comprehensive? Was it a way of was it just something that he knew impressed people and so he kept doing it? What was the motive for him choosing to kind of stick to this? And I'm not saying it's bad. I love that all these muralists are sort of navigating this abstract map of muralism, and some of them are exploring here and letting us know what happened, what this area is like, and if you go here, this is what that looks like, and one goes here, and I love that Diego Rivera has mapped out what it looks like with all these figures, and I think it is very effective in some ways. But it makes me wonder, what was he going for? It could be him replicating European frescoes with lots of people in the picture. um, but that might be just something to think about more as we look at Siqueiros' response to Rivera and Orozco visually. You see the picture above doesn't quite show you that it flattens out the mural, and you can't appreciate the dynamic use of space here. And this was originally in someone's private home. I believe it's moved to another location. A lot of people of significance a lot of the time. Yeah, so yeah, the energy, so numbers of people maybe shows the energy of the business of the revolution. Of course, they're all trying to show Mexico, and so you're going to maybe include, in the name of inclusion, you're going to err on the side of as many people as possible. So already you see Siqueiros providing an alternative vision of mural making to um, the other ones. And I think you can also see there's that red blanket is a motif in Siqueiros' work. And I again want to ask you to consider looking at the red and blue as some kind of weird magical spell floating around all these muralists. And I'm curious to see if that red and blue, we discover that that has some kind of greater significance beyond, and it might just be it's a discovery about how these two colors have a certain as a combination are very powerful at a large scale. And I think you'll see that it's something that pollinates or fertilizes Jackson Pollock to a degree, especially when you think of taking all this and abstracting it, but leaving it at big scale. And remember, this is a portrait of Mexico, so you might consider, are these meant to be personifications of certain elements of Mexico? Is it meant to be, different facets of the story of Mexican history? I think in this case, it looks like a very distinct challenge to the idea of tackling Mexican history. Well, of course, it's Mexico today, so it's not the Mexican Revolution. But this might be something worth writing about. It's so spare and so immediate, and we'll see more murals. I don't want to spend too much time on this one. Um, it kind of reminds me of the Orozco Brotherhood of the murals at the New School. Very long and kind of not filled with too much stuff, and you're kind of collecting little pieces here and there. And the figure on the right with the red star, very militant visualization of Mexico. So if you're to look at Mexico today, we see maybe two guys sleeping on the ground, which could be I don't know if that's meant to be, poverty or, have sleeping on the ground or floating in the air. I think they're meant to be sleeping on the ground. I can't remember if this is a president overwatching them. But certainly each of these, that could be Zapata kind of figure with a gun, and then maybe your average Mexican person. These remind me of some of the women we saw in the photographs. I wonder if there is a visual quotation there, but on the steps of a pyramid, which is an Aztec reference, maybe Teotihuacan. But on the far right, this militant figure poking out and with a gun in a niche seems to imply that Mexico today is has this sort of brewing revolution or communist sympathies. And remember this red blanket. We'll see it again. I love that S shape. So, and it's very emotional. It looks like maybe even the figure has some blood coming out of his mouth. But I think you really will see this a very strong emotional quality to Siqueiros. And here is Orozco's painting of Zapatista's March. And I think this is one of those moments where you can feel a similarity in style between the two. And I think Siqueiros might be influenced by Orozco in the sense of these repeating sombreros, these repeating figures, and uh, even kind of the emotional quality of the colors and the dynamic, almost dance-like quality to some Orozco. I think you see Siqueiros take that torch and run with it while adding all these other experimental techniques. And he doesn't really stick to one. You'll see today that he experiments with a lot of different techniques, and he doesn't stick to one. He really keeps, I think, pushing the boundaries, pushing what you can do with mural format, and to wonderful results. So one of the major murals in his career, especially because this is a mural that's still in the United States and has been restored, is this one, America Tropical, in 1932. And the name itself is a little kind of, well, what do you think what about the name? Maybe even Spanish speakers, he's saying America, so it's not United States necessarily. Often we, especially in this class, I'll sometimes mistakenly, use those two words synonymously, but of course, America could be the new world. So what do you think the title is referring to? It almost feels humorous to me, like tropical is like cha-cha-cha, or kind of treating America as kind of maybe more superficially. What do you think of that title, the title America Tropical? Is there something kind of silly about the title? Is it, what's he saying by adding the tropical part?
I think that maybe he's just referencing nature.
Okay, yeah, it could be like a more referencing,
Because
referring,
he
framing
likes,
it.
yeah, since he's painted the trees and it's kind of like a tropical forest that they could be
Okay,
at. That's what
okay,
he's
yeah,
referencing.
it feels like it's almost like an icebreaker that's sort of like, okay, this is like, I feel like the person who commissioned this, if I remember correctly, the person kind of said, hey, yeah, give me something tropical kind of, and I think he might be making a joke about how the person who commissioned this expected Siqueiros to give him something kind of like, Mexican flavor in the most silly, or not silly, but cliche sense. And the person commissioning didn't realize he was talking to David Alfaro Siqueiros, who is not at all someone who's going to give you this sort of colorful cha-cha-cha, or maybe mariachi view of, I shouldn't say cha-cha-cha because that's more Cuba, but like a mariachi or some tropical vision of Mexico, which satisfies this sort of American exotic attitude towards Mexico. And I think that's, to a degree, what you see in some of what one idea with which you should approach his painting, his kind of lampooning of American attitudes towards Latin America and or Mexico. And you could consider this subject matter broader than just Mexico, perhaps all of America, all of Latin America, or perhaps North America and Latin America as a whole. Note the year 1932. This is right around when Diego Rivera had finished his work at the MoMA, and was supported very much by the Rockefellers, which earned him a lot of criticism. And this is the era of the good neighbor policy. And I think Siqueiros is well aware of this game of political game and the politics in the backdrop of his trip to the United States. And so these are some quotes about America Tropical. And let's see if the mural itself proves these quotes accurate. So, it says, the decline and struggles of indigenous cultures to overcome against European and US imperialist expansion and colonialism in Latin America. So we've talked a lot about that this semester, and you might update that in terms of what's going on in the 1930s with maybe Hitler, but also maybe Siqueiros remembering during the Mexican Revolution how the United States played a big role both in the things that led to the revolution, like the Caranea miners revolt, in which the Mexican government kind of bowed to the influences of the United States and crushed the rebellion, and all the way up to the United States sending maybe even troops in during the revolution. So Siqueiros is very critical of the United States, and I think he's using this mural as a chance to vent those criticisms. And the second quote here is, the mural's thematic content begins to cause both praise and condemnation. By 1934, within months, a third of the mural, the part that was viewable from the street, was whitewashed. So, whitewash means covering it up with basically, erasing it. And eventually the whole mural is painted over. And you should wonder, well, what causes such an outrage? What causes such an outcry almost immediately after unveiling the mural? And happily, today, I think you can go visit this mural because history now, and if you think about Chicano, the whole Chicano art movement, you have to attribute the reemergence of this mural to them, or to that movement, and to a degree, because that really celebrates the contribution of Latin America to California. And so he's almost foreshadowing the sort of the power of this sort of Chicano art in Los Angeles. And today you can, of course, see the mural. It's now been restored mostly, I think. And here it is after having been whitewashed or covered up. It's an odd location. It looks like it's on the second floor. There you can see on the left and on the right. It looks like it's like on the second floor. LA is huge, sprawling city, and I can't remember if I was in this area, but it looks like there's a long kind of pedestrian promenade, and it was visible up above. You can almost see a staircase there on the right leading to it. But these pictures capture the era when it was covered up and whitewashed, and really had sort of almost vanished from view until more recent decades, when people realized, wait a second, we've got a Siqueiros up there. That's a big deal. That's like kind of having treasure, finding treasure in your attic. So here it is. And I think you can appreciate how horribly they mutilated it, and how vibrant and colorful it is, almost like revealing the Sistine Chapel murals after they were covered by soot for decades, and revealing what an exquisite painter Michelangelo turned out to have been. So tell me about this mural. What's the focal point? What do you think causes outrage in the United States here in 1932 in Los Angeles? What's so upsetting? Anyone have an idea what might have upset people in the United States, or in particular some Americans, about this mural? Maggie, yes.
Could it be the middle figure?
Yeah, what about that middle figure?
I want to say it almost looks like Jesus getting crucified, but it's not really like a true crucifixion in that sense.
Yeah, I think he's definitely resurrecting, good word choice there, resurrecting some Christ-like imagery here. And what about that? What's he doing with that Christ-like imagery? Who is that? Jesus?
I would say it's probably just some individual. I don't know if it's referencing maybe Jesus. I mean, the cross, it kind of does symbolize that, but I think it's more of this resurrection, like you said, of Aztec, like, what is it, mythology, or their, like, what's it called, spiritual beliefs, I guess.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that
Yeah, so I don't want to answer yet. So think about maybe who, if it's not Jesus, who this might be, and let's revisit that. So I agree, there's the centerpiece, the focal point here is probably the epicenter of the controversy. And it might have something to do with Christianity, but I think you'll see well, let's see a little further. What else do we see moving outward away from our epicenter of outrage? What else? And I agree with Maggie, it's not quite a crucifixion in the traditional sense. You see maybe another layer of anchoring the subject, the double crucifixion, if you will. But that's something to consider, to answer still, like who that might be. It's not Jesus, but it's sort of almost like the same idea of crucifying. What's the story of Jesus is meant to be meant to be a sympathetic story about someone who's persecuted and crucified, right? So you might think, who is this person being persecuted and crucified? What else do we see in the painting moving away from the focal point? Yes, Jasenia. Oh, sorry. I guess I'm just admitting you, Jasenia. Anyone else have a? What else? What else do you see in the painting? And Jasenia, you're just joining us. We're looking at the America Tropical by Siqueiros, and this painting caused a lot of outrage to the point where it was whitewashed, as you can see here. It was covered up for many decades and revealed only in the last few decades. What else do you see? What's above the crucifix?
The eagle from like the Mexican flag, I think.
Yeah, it's that's something to consider. Is it Mexican eagle? Or could this be a reference to the United States? Because the eagle could, of course, be, you know, literally the eagle on the cactus, representing the place where Tenochtitlan was founded. You also have the major Aztec leader after Montezuma, whose name meant fallen eagle or descending eagle, if I remember. So there could be a reference to him. We'll see him later on in lecture. So that's another thing to consider. What else? Well, we see this temple. What is that? Do you see that layer above, like behind the eagle? What do you think that is behind the eagle? This horizontal bar of kind of squiggly-ish, almost Keith Haring like. What is that there? What's that meant to be? That's obviously part of the building, but what is
Like
that? Go ahead.
runes on a temple,
Say again.
like runes. I think that's what they call it when they write stuff in the temple. They carve the writing.
Yeah, like hieroglyphs. Yeah, like some kind
something
of writing.
like that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
something like that.
remember at the time, I don't think scholars or anthropologists or linguists, I don't think they had yet translated the Maya hieroglyphs into not cuneiform, but I can't remember the word they used for Maya hieroglyphs, but they hadn't yet translated the language. So this might be Siqueiros just sort of making some visualization um, of Aztec language or Maya language, but in a sort of abstracted way, shorthand way. What else do we see here? Now we'll get back to, we'll kind of put these pieces together in a moment. What else do we see? The figures on the right almost remind me of that crouching communist leader we saw in the Portrait of Mexico today. So you're noticing some reoccurring elements. What about those trees? I guess that could be the tropical part that someone just referred to, maybe the jungle being gobbled up by the trees is kind of like what we saw with Bonampak, the mural being discovered in the middle of the jungle. And those, what are those, like ceiba trees, or what's the other tree that I forgot before, but I think it's distinctly kind of a tree that perhaps is more tropical, but it's also, I think, meant to be a visual element to maybe like a kind of impenetrable jungle. And the red elements on the left and the right, one on the right looks a little more modern, the one on the left looks more like some kind of maybe monument. So what's going on here? What causes the outrage? Why does this get whitewashed? Well, I think it has to do with this figure in the center. And I think to answer the question is, I think that figure is meant to be a crucified indigenous man or person. So why is that upsetting?
America is very crude, especially in the early 1900s. I feel like there's like anything related to nudity or like goriness and violence. I feel like they're very like, no, we cannot show the public this.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's important to remember or to know that earlier in the United States, I think a lot of the flavor, the tone of the United States today comes from the 1960s. We're a lot less puritanical, although that's not to say that all that we haven't left behind some of that puritanism, for better or for worse. But I think you would, many people would probably agree that the United States is a lot more liberal, less religious, perhaps, when we were, depending on where you are. Of course, there's a lot of exceptions, but and then maybe in the 1930s, Los Angeles, where, if you think about the Chicano movement was a reaction to racism in California. Today, we would think of California as probably more of a melting pot or a salad bowl, whereas in the 1930s, Los Angeles was probably a boom town with a Hollywood on the rise and with a lot of segregation, either literally legally imposed, but also, looking down on people of Latin descent. And certainly there was no inclusion of Latin Americans in any sort of meaningful way as part of this sort of accepted everyday fabric of, quote unquote, your Americanness or United States identity. So this kind of is, I think a real controversial use of Jesus Christ as a sort of reference point for the crucifixion of the Native Americans. And I think there's one other, probably, and if I remember the controversy, the eagle, in at least from Siqueiros' point of view, was meant to be a symbol of the United States involvement in Mexico. And I think the conclusion basically was that he's created this, instead of giving them this tropical vision of Mexico or Latin America, he's made this very incendiary comment on how the United States is this colonial power crucifying Mexico the same way the Romans crucified Jesus. And probably the people whitewashing it didn't even need to get to that degree of nuance. They just saw a Jesus Christ-like figure being crucified, and it probably felt like some kind of mocking form of a way of mocking Christianity and subverting Christianity. And it's not at all a flattering view of history. And making a crucifixion, a crucified Native American in the middle of the painting is perhaps not what the people who commissioned the painting were looking for. So already Siqueiros is pushing buttons, and I love how simple and it's not Diego Rivera filling the canvas with lots of figures. It's one figure in the middle, and that's enough to be controversial. And I think more interestingly for me is this question of that band of writing that you see behind the eagle. And I think this is worth further investigation, and I can't tell you if I'm right or wrong here, or if I'm even close to right. But when I see that band of hieroglyphs in the back, especially because I do read those as sort of Siqueiros translating however he sees the Aztec or Maya language into a sort of architectural band of into an architectural band here, as in band of a strip of writing. I think I see that when I see graffiti in New York. So this is, I don't know if this is 5 Points up in Queens before they destroyed it and made condominiums in the last 10 years. For me, when I see graffiti, what I notice is it's very hard to read. It's illegible by definition. It's not meant to necessarily be understood except unless you are in the know, unless you're part of the inner circle of people who, or just the artist, him or herself, who knows what the graffiti says. So there's an almost defiance of legibility when it comes to graffiti. It's like almost turning a word into a picture. And it comes from Los Angeles originally, if I remember. The graffiti or kind of this spray painting comes probably from LA. It's probably, I wonder if Siqueiros contributed this kind of this facet of Latin America, Los Angeles art by using spray paint quite a bit in his artwork. And I wonder if his illegible kind of Aztec hieroglyphs are the origin of graffiti. And it sounds, as I say it, it sounds almost like I want that to be the case, because it's just so interesting to think about that. But I wouldn't be surprised it has a big impact, at least, maybe some impact on graffiti artists on the West Coast, that would mean that Siqueiros has an even more deep impact on cross-pollination, the New World, influencing the lights of Jackson Pollock, but also perhaps even the graffiti movement. So this would be a fascinating thing to research. Maybe you want to look at, if you're interested in graffiti, to kind of see if there is, can you trace the origin of graffiti back to 1930s Los Angeles, and even perhaps Siqueiros, or maybe they both found a common point of origin with spray paint. And spray paint is an obvious choice for painting outside in public quickly, maybe using stencils, but certainly getting your message on a wall outside is much easier than using a paintbrush. And it's something for you to maybe just consider. There's something about the illegibility of graffiti that reminds me very much of these hieroglyphs in the background behind the Siqueiros figure here. And because he's in the United States, it could be that this could be one of those moments of cross-pollination, or maybe not. It sounds like a pretty zany theory, and yet I see it so similar to this sort of illegible graffiti, the sort of use of writing as a kind of visual statement, but not necessarily meant like a code language almost. So that's something to think about. I love the idea that spray paint is this common tool used by both graffiti artists and Siqueiros. And when was the spray can invented? Where was it invented? And why? For what purposes was it invented? And the graffiti artists took it and used it for their own purposes, which is to kind of territorialize public space or make one's mark on public space. And if it is the case, well, then you can extend Siqueiros' influence all the way into the 1980s with the likes of Basquiat and Keith Haring and others. And muralism then would connect to the idea of graffiti art putting pictures in public that are by definition controversial or incendiary. Here's another example of Siqueiros' America Tropical. Looks like this is more of like a banner or some kind of printout placed somewhere else, but you can appreciate it's been restored to public acceptance. And it reminds me of the controversy surrounding man control of the universe. Remember, the Rockefeller Center mural by Rivera was not whitewashed, but really crumbled, like hammered. I think they probably took a jackhammer and destroyed it. And so this was whitewashed about the same time, or destroyed. I mean, whitewashed more like censored, destroyed. As Rivera said, it was culturally vandalized. And the same way, the America Tropical was whitewashed at the same time, probably like 1933, 1934. So these guys are both earning their bona fides. They're proving their political bona fides to the radical side of the political spectrum by having Rockefeller destroy your work of art. You're really saying, hey, yeah, I'm not a sellout. To the contrary. And I think likewise, Siqueiros really wants to make sure that his trip in the United States isn't just him selling out or seen as him selling out so much as him being true to his political underpinnings. So I think it has a big impact. Something about LA has a big impact on Siqueiros. And I think you see this having a big impact on the Chicano art movement, because there's a few Chicano artists who literally quote or copy this picture. I think it's if something's on fire, but I think in the case of the Chicano artist, it's a car, like a car that's set on fire. And as as artists, or maybe even as painters, some of you, one of the real challenges with painting is finding subject matter that's either not cliche or that has something. It's one thing to maybe project a picture onto a wall and trace it and paint it, and that's not the same as as finding subject matter, because maybe you found something to paint, but the way you paint it also matters. And so, this real puzzle, the real dilemma of painting today is finding subject matter that's fresh, that hasn't sort of been kind of pre-digested, something that's maybe unique and original without being kind of the cliche, almost like Banksy-like kind of juxtaposing politics in a very kind of stencil, quick way, having a deep emotion while still being familiar and meaningful. And so something like this really, I think, is a great example of having a subject that's something, there's something almost surreal about a fire in a city, something emotional about it, but also it's tragedy. It's sort of this maybe like bystander effect where something's happening and the news is covering it. Maybe you hear about it on TVs, maybe like the Beirut explosions we all saw, this sort of devastating explosion. And yet there's something so modern about witnessing a tragedy on TV, but not knowing the person, not knowing them by the first name. There's something beautiful yet kind of anonymous about these tragic spectacles of modern life. You can expand on that, consider that later when we look at Chicano art. But David Siqueiros is really wonderful wizard at finding enlivening painting, or resurrecting painting, or re-envisioning painting, or reinventing painting with this very kind of experimental almost approach. Almost, I don't want to say minimalist. You can almost feel the Orozco colors like here, but just the idea of it's not abstract. It's something on fire somewhere. It's such a huge explosion that you can feel the kind of saturation of the smoke, the density of the smoke here. It's so emotional, and yet it's still recognizable. So he's back at Mexico at this point, and then he eventually goes to the United States. And I'm very interested to know more about how the United States saw Siqueiros. I'm sure at this point they know he's more radical, but he doesn't seem to have burned any bridges completely at this point, because he, in this same year in 1936, he creates this, or he is involved or leads this workshop in New York City, which is attended by the likes of Jackson Pollock and others. And this is one of those major moments of cross-pollination. And I think you can appreciate how this almost kind of resembles what we just saw. There's something, his experimenting, leaving paint in this abstract expressionist kind of painterly way, but really experimenting even more and combining different styles here, to the point that when you look at this, most people, I think, I've seen this for many years, and I never really kind of understood it until last few years and maybe last decade, when I've looked at this painting more and contextualized it. You see a whole range of abstraction, but also recognizable form, but that are so almost lost in the visual confusion here that you might just assume those are just more abstract globs of paint down below. But in fact, what we're seeing down there are these stencils. So we'll go back here to in a moment. I just want to remind you, this is the same time that Prometheus is inspiring Jackson Pollock's work. I think you could feel the color, maybe the influence of Orozco on Siqueiros in terms of color, the brushstroke. But again, that blue, that almost, I don't know if I want to say indigo, but I want to say like indigo blue or deep blue, like a Prussian blue, next to this kind of burnt red. I'm trying to think of what red. What red would you call that? Like it's definitely this particular kind of red. It's been a while since I've touched oil paints, but I think you guys know what I mean. This sort of an earthy red, but particularly in combination with that blue, there's something really magical about that. And you see that here too. For me, I see that the sort of red as like fire, and blue as a sort of almost aquatic, like calming balance to the red. And again, it's one of these mysteries of the muralist movement, how this almost become this character in each of their murals, this red and blue combination. Let's look now at the sort of details. Here's that red and blue in the Pollock, member. So Pollock is one of the people who was at this workshop being influenced by Siqueiros here. And I think you can appreciate Siqueiros' experimentation here. And Jackson Pollock's really famous for his drip, quote unquote, drip paintings, or as some critics call it, apocalyptic wallpaper. And the idea is he starts experimenting with paint, and it's, I think, in response to
look really
yeah,
rotten.
What'd you say?
So
Rotten.
it does
Yeah,
look
yeah.
kind of like it's rotting.
Yeah, no, that's great. A great way of it's like that's a specific emotional response, right? What generates that response, Milton?
I think it's like the sort of almost like it's not like the colors aren't like vibrant in like a traditional sense. Like they look sort of they look textured in like a sort of like moldy kind of way. and like nothing. It kind of, you know what? Best word to describe it. It looks organic. That's the thing that like is in my head. Oh, your squirrel.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree with you. It feels like a lichen or like moss or like some kind of. It's got that the word patina is like when something's been in the water and nature for a long time, it gets corroded. It's kind of got this organic sense of decay or like fungus or something really organic. And of course, it's just paint that almost oozing in a way that has a texture that's so kind of on one extreme of the sort of spectrum of things you can generate with paint. And I think what he's trying to do is maybe experiment with that occupying space alongside more traditional subject matter like you see below. And I completely feel the same way about it. There's something maybe, some people, we all have a sense of what makes us feel gross, that's gross or creepy. Sometimes some people have certain things that are, so I saw a commercial the other day. It was about, I think it was yesterday, about soap, a dial soap. And it was a woman. The commercial was a woman going through New York City or something. She's on the subway, and there's a moment where she brushes up, and you see this guy's hairy arm with sweat on it, and she brushes up against that guy's arm, and she's grossed out, and she goes home and gets in the shower and dial soap. And I remember thinking, like, well, he might have been grossed out by you too. Like everyone has, a sense of what makes us feel grossed out. Maybe it's physical contact with a stranger, maybe someone touching your food. But I think here there's something maybe unnerving about the abstraction here, while also being maybe otherworldly. And I agree, there's something about decay. And I think that maybe is fitting for the subject. If, collective suicide is there's no mincing words, or he's not downplaying anything with that title. I guess collective suicide would be sort of like, what do you think he means by that, Milton? When you think of collective suicide, apart from it sounding like a band name, great name for a band, what else do you think what do you think he's going for with that? Maybe it'll help if we see some more of these details. Here we go. It looks like stencils to me.
Uh, Collective suicide. I mean, aside from being like a super edgy thing to say,
Yeah,
I guess like it's supposed he's referring to like a cultural sense of like self-destruction, I assume, where you like where like a culture or like a I guess civilization collectively like takes out something integral to itself.
yeah, it's great. Yeah, I think literally there might be some kind of confrontation between the Spaniards. I need to look more. I did a little bit of looking into this painting, and I know there is an element of the Native Americans here in the middle literally committing suicide. But I think, as we can all probably at least appreciate, it's probably much more than just that. I like the way you said it. There's something. The collective suicide isn't necessarily literally, impaling yourself and jumping off a cliff, but also more that you've lost something integral. I think that's a really great way of putting it. You might see like in Nazi Germany, once you follow Hitler, Germany loses its some kind of sense of humanity, right? And you might think of what is that line you cross when culturally you start committing suicide, and it could be when you as a culture start believing some lie, or maybe when you sell out, like some kind of selling out. But I think that goes into why this kind of messy or decay like or organic like quality to the painting is somehow an emotional mirror to this idea, like you said, Milton, with like losing something integral to yourself. And it's not just necessarily killing yourself literally, but like what would it mean for you to commit suicide without literally committing suicide? Well, it would be losing your sense of self, losing your sense of identity, selling out something deeply meaningful to yourself. And this is all maybe very resonant when you think of politics and the idea of being true to your principles, perhaps. But you could also see this, of course, as more of a historical comment on maybe the conquest. But this use of stenciling is so interesting as a solution to maybe repeating figures. And they're so contrasting. He could just paint by hand and then have these abstract, organic other elements, but he chose the most extreme contrast to organic flowy paint, which is a stencil, right? And I don't think you see a lot of stenciling in a lot of the history of art until you really get to Banksy. And I think it's like spray paint, like graffiti. It's really intended to be something that, you know, or maybe even capitalism, to put your mark outside quickly on the wall, and get out of there before you get arrested. And I don't think that's what he's doing here, but it's interesting that now you have stenciling and almost like spray paint and graffiti, which are both like the two key tools of graffiti and, you know, Banksy, for instance. I don't think it's super effective here, at least in my own sort of, you know, purist, snobby opinion, as far as, you know, in an ideal sense. I think the stenciling for me is always tricky as a sort of something that has depth. You know, he's repeating the stencil here to give you a sense of depth. So I guess he cut out all these stencils and repeated it. Stenciling for me is very quick, and, you know, if I made a stencil, it'd be hard not to look like Banksy. And if you try to not look like Banksy, you might have to add more time and technique, which might mean you're now taking more time, and no, it's no longer this quick act of defiance in public space. Yet again, another link to graffiti and stenciling, and maybe, you know, what you see coming out of the West Coast with Chicano art or graffiti art. And this is where Jackson Pollock attended his workshop. And before we take a break, I just want to show you some of the elements of this workshop. And there's Siqueiros, by the way, in the middle there. I can't tell if it's Jackson Pollock and his brother both attended this workshop. And you see above, he's got his spray paint, you know, spray gun. So, you know, using spray paint is going to give him a lot more of the sort of smooth spectrum of color, covering a lot more space more quickly. And it's very like a modern tool that's going to just even make his work even more kind of unlike maybe Rivera or Siqueiros. And so Jackson Pollock's style really shifts away from this maybe more expressive quality to more abstraction, like you see here. And I think, again, that red and blue, that Prussian blue with a lot of texture and quality, as in like contrast of texture, and that red, almost fiery red, side by side with like this kind of bland yellow or kind of soft yellow. Really feels like he's almost recreating, like distilling some of these tools, these elements, removing all the figures, but preserving that emotional energy, which I think is so, for me, important for understanding the abstract expressionist movement. So very briefly, these are some of the guiding principles of his workshop, Siqueiros' workshop in New York City. And you can imagine what it must have been like to have been in such a cool moment in time. So experimentation, number one, and, you know, that means doing something different, you know, trying, what if I do this? What if I do that? And so it's sort of like pure research. And so that's kind of like number two. Number three, studying the relationship between classical and modern techniques and of art or art creation and the corresponding epochs. So maybe having an understanding of history and seeing what works in the classical period versus what works in the modern era, and making something fitting for that. Development of new art production techniques appropriate to modern times, producing public forms of works of art that are understandable and accessible to the general public. That kind of goes back to the point of the Mexican muralist, to visualize Mexico for Mexicans, and then working and studying collectively in an environment without hierarchy. You know, that's kind of the modus operandi. The one that's most interesting to me as far as the future of art is this one here, because I think someone like Jackson Pollock will completely embrace all of these things here, especially, you know, his shift to drip painting or flinging paint at the canvas. Famously, he listed jazz music while he painted, so his work becomes very much about the process of making art. But that all comes from this experimental workshop. I think he missed rule number 5, though, but that might be just part and parcel of being an abstract artist, which is your art isn't going to necessarily be easily understood by the public at large. Or maybe maybe they're trying to make that, you know, abstract art more understood, understandable, more defining the characteristically American, something uniquely American contribution to this modern era. But I think you'd agree that a lot of the public will always have a hard time kind of framing abstract art into more kind of digestible relationship to maybe history and society. And so I think that's the one thing in this workshop that maybe that Pollock will shift away from, which is the idea of kind of accessibility. But that's debatable, and that's something really worth thinking about more, the accessibility of abstract art versus maybe the accessibility of large scale abstract expressionist art, which has more emotion, more expression, and then huge monumental form of emotional art. And is it still accessible, at least emotionally, if not in terms of content and maybe history and society? So we'll take a break now, and we'll get back to this workshop and more importantly, how Siqueiros continues his political involvement in things like the Spanish Civil War, in which he becomes a colonel. And so he's a really interesting character who's going all over the place, painting, getting into controversy, while also being a true revolutionary, fighting on the front lines in Spain and in Mexico, and in student movements in Mexico in the 1960s. So let's take about a 10-minute break, and we'll get back at 9:55. Okay? Any questions? If not, I'll see you in a moment. Oops, sorry, little buddy. Hear me? So after this workshop, like the same year of this workshop, Siqueiros gets the call, and I think he's in New York City brushing shoulders with other exiles from Spain who are rallying support for this Spanish Civil War, which, as we pointed out in previous classes, is a rehearsal, quote unquote, dress rehearsal for World War II, and is a site. And I think in previous lectures, I might have said World War I, it has World War II, which of course starts in the late 30s. And the Spanish Civil War is a spot, the site of sort of the forces of liberalism versus the forces of fascism. And a lot of people from around the world, including the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, United States, or voluntary soldiers, voluntary conscript, or I wouldn't be conscript, volunteers go to Spain to serve on the Republican side against Franco, against the forces of Franco, including Siqueiros, who becomes a colonel. And he becomes a colonel because he's got all that fighting experience during the Mexican Revolution when he was, his boots were on the ground fighting. So he's a real, he's not a sort of Diego Rivera who was in Europe the whole time during the Mexican Revolution. Siqueiros is a, what would you call it, a guerrilla in the guerrilla army. And you'll see he ends up being one of the people who tries to assassinate Leon Trotsky. I mean, that blows me away. So he's involved in the Spanish Civil War, which again is one of these romantic conflicts without necessarily, I mean, it does have a lot of horrible stories and legacies in Spain, but it doesn't necessarily have, it's not the final word on fascism, or at least one of the next major words on fascism, which will be Hitler and of course the Holocaust. So the Spanish Civil War is this conflict of the similar forces that sets the stage for World War II. And Siqueiros is there for several years fighting on the ground. And you can imagine this is only going to make him all the more political and enhances revolutionary bona fides. And you see this red blanket, maybe not a blanket, but like some kind of red fabric, which is like a protection or a foundation here. And we see this repeat in several paintings. We've seen it before in the portrait of Mexico today. It could be a communist symbol. Seems to be maybe a symbol of violence. And it almost feels like this is like the mother, this is the child. These are both paintings that are coming out of his experience in the Spanish Civil War. And I remember seeing this painting in textbooks growing up, reading about history, maybe world history. And this was often used to illustrate the Spanish Civil War and or the rise of fascism. It's very emotional, and this is a masterpiece. Like a lot of other, a few other muralists have certain paintings that I think really stand out on their own as such a vital part of the conversation about fascism and war And I think, the emotion here is clear, the baby screaming, and that, the head is bigger, maybe to emphasize the screaming. It's like magnitude of screaming, and the industrial detritus. There are some elements of that painting we just saw a moment ago, that decay you were talking about, Milton. I almost feel a little bit of that here at the bottom, with the metal kind of rusting away. But it looks like just a horrible picture of war and industrialization. I see one tree and the baby's crying because it doesn't maybe have someone, the mother or something. Maybe this is the mother lying dead. But I see that common thread being the red blanket you see here. None of that bright blue here. And I think the reason why I wouldn't put the bright blue in this picture is because I think he reserves that red and blue perhaps for kind of moments that need that element. I think if you add that blue here, it would add too much beauty or too much poetry, visual poetry or magic to a moment that's really meant to be a different note, one note, which is kind of pain and suffering, abandonment. Not a happy picture, right? Definitely a painting about maybe war and the collateral damage of war. Here he is with a woman he meets in Spain. All these artists, Orozco was married, but they don't make perhaps their personal life the main subject of their artwork the way Frida Kahlo does. So you kind of have to, frame your understanding of the painting based on however, the personal lives might not penetrate into their subject matter. I think in the case of Siqueiros, his politics certainly pervade. You can't separate his art from his politics. And Leon Trotsky is escaping from Stalin's centralization of the Soviet Union. Remember, the whole world is sort of preparing for this war with Hitler, but kind of waiting after that is, or postponed for when that showdown is finished, is the showdown with Stalin. And Stalin has his own showdown within the Soviet Union, centralizing power and ousting the likes of Trotsky, who you see here with Siqueiros on the left and Diego Rivera in the middle, both kind of loving whatever Trotsky's talking about there. I can only imagine I remember in the book I read or reading in the other class, in this classes, Trotsky was not a very humorous guy. So it looks like he's entertaining the heck out of Rivera and Siqueiros here. But again, I think it's a question for me if Rivera and Siqueiros were estranged for a while, because I think Rivera hosted Leon Trotsky or welcomed him, and then his friend Siqueiros tries to assassinate Leon Trotsky. So, and I don't know, I wish I did, and I apologize for not knowing more about that. I don't think it's central to understanding Siqueiros, but I think it's an important thing to understand about whether or not Diego Rivera and Leon Trotsky had a brief falling out because of this. And if you remember, Frida Kahlo is offering her sort of mestiza princess identity to Leon Trotsky as sort of like a love triangle going on in response to Rivera cheating on her with her sister Christina. So I do wonder if I'd like to know more about the soap opera in the Rivera Kahlo house, or how that relates to Leon Trotsky. Now this, when we talk about when I look at this, it's like, wow, Siqueiros is so ambitious and so capable and so versatile. I mean, just look at how much time it took to paint. And, I don't think he cut corners. I don't want to say cut corners. I don't think he made his job any easier or efficient by using too much stenciling here, as much as maybe perhaps spray painting. But even if he did, it still feels like I don't see spray painting making it look any less kind of impressive. The blue and the red I see reappear. It's here. That blue and the red combination is so powerful, maybe for pushing space backwards, the blue, and bringing space forward with the red, and adding that yellow, kind of hazy yellow, seems to be a really interesting visual balance. Perhaps that's a solution to working on such a big scale, but the dynamism here is it's such a powerful picture of industry, and it has some of that Orozco quality. Like Milton, you might notice that Orozco has a lot of machinery and these repeating mechanical forms, like in the Dartmouth murals and in his tank and dive bomber. But I think he's really sees technology as nightmarish, whereas Rivera sees technology as full of promise and prosperity. In this case, Siqueiros, I feel like he's kind of referencing back to the Thomas Hart Benton painting we've seen or have seen, or you see here. And for me, when I like, my first thing is I'm trying to figure out this red and blue, this sort of Rosetta Stone, or this deciphering this red and blue, and I couldn't help but going back to the Thomas Hart Benton paintings when we saw them during the Orozco lecture. And immediately I noticed the smokestacks and of course that red and blue. And it just makes me wonder if that's another, these artists are cross-pollinating and we still don't know more about that. Maybe Vita Americana does a great job filling out the story, but there might be a little more to be told as far as, getting into their day-to-day biographies and their diaries and finding out, when they visited, if they ever visited Thomas Hart Benton, and especially Siqueiros, the smokestacks and the red and blue really give me a feeling, that dynamism that you see here too. But the repeating mechanical form, repeating that looks like a ladder climbing up that chimney, that feels very Orozco-like, repeating these mechanical shapes, because it's that's kind of part of industry, these repeated forms and the sort of godlike power of the machine, very dynamic. No real focal point here necessarily, right? It says, portrait of the bourgeoisie. I guess I'm pretty sure that's what that is, but I'm not sure how that relates. There's a few more murals we're going to look at. I just want to point out that red and blue again is very dynamic color combination. And this is the same time. Remember, Siqueiros is a little younger than the other muralists, so this very important MoMA show of Mexican art comes when Siqueiros was probably a little younger. He had already done his mural in Los Angeles, and we have seen a little bit of this exhibit, and Siqueiros has some place in that exhibit, if you remember. He's acknowledged, but I don't think it's as important for Siqueiros as it was for Rockefeller and as it was for Orozco, who makes his dive bomber and tank here at the MoMA. And these pictures really show that mending of fences between Mexico and the United States. So this could help explain why Siqueiros hasn't been just permanently banned from the United States for being so politically active, or perhaps, it's perhaps because the communist threat isn't so important as the Hitler threat right now. And of course, Orozco was commissioned to make this famous mural in New York at the MoMA, and it's got that bright red and that deep blue, which I really can't, at this point, it's really hard for me to not think there's some deep kind of cross-pollination between these artists just on that element alone. Maybe they're just all sort of find it like a cool visual element to add, but you really see that, the red and blue, such a powerful, like I said, combination of colors. And that repeated mechanical forms that you see in Orozco here really reminds me of some elements of Siqueiros, repeating forms into infinity, almost maybe not emotionalizing the machine so much, and maybe not treating it as such a part of kind of maybe capitalism and decay and industrial nightmarish scale of industry. But you do see that expressive quality to both. And I think maybe why Siqueiros is harder for me to appreciate is maybe because, and maybe more of a criticism of my own character, that it's easier to kind of like things that you can understand and put into a neat, tidy box. And perhaps Siqueiros is so experimental that my brain is overloaded and it's overwhelmed. And maybe in the end, we like kind of things that we can understand, and anything that's harder to understand is harder to rally behind. Just trying to figure out what it is about Siqueiros, who is definitely contributes to this whole vision of muralism and comes out of the tradition of the other two and contributes his own thing. But maybe, could be perhaps he drifts into the 60s and 70s when art gets a little kind of dated for me. So that could be it, that Siqueiros is still kind of, his output is colored by the time period he lives in. And I tend to find painting in the 60s and 70s a little dated. And that could be something about, that could explain some of that. So here he is in disguise. And like I said, he's kind of like a Che Guevara. Che Guevara puts on a disguise in order to travel to Latin America to fight the communist revolutions in Bolivia. And he has a really elaborate disguise to get through customs and under the radar of the United States. And it's not unlike Siqueiros putting on this disguise here. Now, importantly, and especially when we look at Cuba, Che Guevara can't go fight the revolutions in Africa or Asia where there's more susceptible to communism, because he doesn't really blend in. He'd stand out like a sore thumb. And I think that goes a long way in explaining why Che Guevara ends up fighting and dying in Bolivia, because that's the only place he would have been able to fight without immediately being recognized. And I think Siqueiros likewise has a similar challenge with being an international revolutionary and him being very recognizable. And I guess he's in disguise here so that he can avoid being imprisoned for his role in the assassination of Leon Trotsky. He's not the one who killed Trotsky, but he was involved in it. And you have to conclude that they had a conversation with Diego Rivera, who ends up making they're friends at the end. So I wonder if that is the unspoken, kind of unwritten story here. I'd like to know more about. If I don't think Rivera was involved in the assassination of Trotsky, but I think Rivera was involved in the pardoning of Siqueiros. So that's something I'd like to know more about and research, not because it's essential for understanding Siqueiros' work, but I think it's an important part of understanding the relationship between between Rivera and Siqueiros, especially in terms of being accepted by the Communist Party and fulfilling their obligations to communism. So because of this period and killing Trotsky or being involved in the assassination, this is when he goes to Cuba for the first time. He goes to Cuba, if I recall, during the period of Batista's first term as president in the 1940s. And this is a time, Cuba, as we'll learn later, is a colony whose independence was postponed until 1898, and even then it was co-opted by the United States. So Cuba is a fascinating destination for someone as political as Siqueiros, because, as you know, Cuba becomes a real epicenter for communism starting in 1959 with the communist revolution there. So almost he feels like the sort of kind of a precursor, a visitor like Ana Mendieta was. She visits Cuba in the 1980s. We'll learn about her maybe another day. But someone who's like a Che Guevara, international revolutionary, maybe even like a James Bond. But Siqueiros precedes all those others. So he's this sort of model, an archetype of international revolutionary with this, exquisite contribution to painting too. And I think that kind of sets the stage for the Cold War, being this era of intrigue and political persecution and paranoia and toxicity between the United States and Cuba and the Soviet Union, which really plays out in Cuba. So here, I think if I remember from the reading, he's trying to get a visa to the United States. And, this is right after the MoMA exhibit in New York of Orozco and Rivera and Mexican art. So I think that Siqueiros wasn't given a visa to the United States, perhaps because of his involvement in politics. And now, things were getting heated up. This is towards when the World War II is wrapping up. So this could be, communism starting to rear its head in a more threatening way to the United States. And so Siqueiros is doing something that's, I think, trying to get into the good graces of the United States here with this painting showing Lincoln and Jose Marti. Jose Marti is a major figure from Cuban independence. Now, I don't know if these murals are still around in Cuba. Next time I go to Cuba, I will hunt them down. Sadly, we don't have the greatest reproductions of them, but you can appreciate him taking this style and bringing it to Cuba and almost kind of sowing the seeds of revolution in Cuba. And I really want to know also more about if when Siqueiros was in Cuba, which is in 1943, he met up with another major artist, not just in Cuba, but around the world, with Fredo Lam, who was in Cuba painting his masterpiece, The Jungle, in 1943. And The Jungle was a sort of way of reclaiming Afro-American heritage in Cuba from the sort of forces of discrimination against Afro-Cuban culture in Cuba. Like in Cuba at the time, you weren't allowed to practice Santeria or Afro-Cuban religions because it was seen as something that might corrupt the youth, the white youth in Cuba. So Diego Rivera is in Cuba, brushing shoulders with other revolutionaries who are against the different kind of dictators / presidents who are puppets of the United States. And I'd like to know more about this era. I'd like to know more about these murals. I do know a few of them. At least one of them, I think, is still around. He painted it in the Hotel Sevilla here, the Sevilla, Baltimore, in Havana, in order to pay his rent. So he painted these murals in the mural in the lobby inside this kind of colonial Mudéjar kind of Spanish-inspired building. And you see this a lot in Cuba, anywhere there's colonial Latin America, this almost the Islamic influence from southern Spain. I think it's called the Mudéjar style, with a lot of ceramic, a lot of tessellations. And Cuba has a lot of it. It's really wonderful. You see it a lot in southern Spain. And here's Wilfredo Lamb's painting The Jungle, which is in the MoMA too. So, the MoMA is where, like I said in my other lecture, where the Western world apologizes for colonialism. And, Diego Rivera, I'm sorry, Siqueiros painting some paintings in Cuba in the 1930s, like 1940s, comes kind of after the peak era of Mexican muralism. And it's coming at a time of him running away from political persecution in Mexico. If I remember, he goes to Chile initially, and Pablo Neruda helps convince, I think, Cardenas, the president of Mexico, to pardon Siqueiros. So just the idea of Siqueiros hanging out with Pablo Neruda, going to Cuba, Spanish Civil War, controversy in Los Angeles. It's really this colorful life, which is probably even more colorful than Diego Rivera's life, including having Frida Kahlo as part of that color. So you see again these fist closed, this almost Lady Liberty like figure floating over Cuba, I guess. And we see that. I think my other class, someone did a picture of a poster almost revisiting this revolutionary pose, the maternal revolutionary figure, the nourishing vision of the state, not like the disciplinarian father, like the caring, nourishing state, as a symbol of communism, right? Communism fights for the weakest, right? Fights for social services and social welfare. And that is a contrast, political contrast to the survival of the fittest of capitalism. So this closed fist holding the flag and the woman with the bare breast is like this nourishing vision of fighting for the weakest. The revolution is for the weakest parts of society, not the strongest. And so I think that's really the origin of Siqueiros. Remember, he was in Europe with Diego Rivera in the 1900s, early 1900s. And so that could be something he saw that inspired him to continue with wrestling or refining his sense of revolutionary imagery. Of course, he takes Lady Liberty, who here is holding the gun with the bayonet, leading the people, almost as sort of like a personification of liberty here. And he takes her and adds a whole nother extreme. It looks like she's breaking the bonds of slavery here. She's got the torch in the right hand. So this is almost like looking at the Statue of Liberty, semi-nude, breaking the bonds of slavery. And look at how big it is. I mean, look at it and how expressive it is. Even though it's almost blocky, like Botero, like kind of blocky shapes, it still is so emotional. And like Maggie said, I don't know if it was Maggie, but someone said, Emma, that the colors are so bright and poppy, and they really do. Or not, maybe not as much as Orozco. I think you were saying that Orozco's colors are brighter. Maybe this is Siqueiros trying to maybe key up the lighting to make it more dynamic, more bright. But you do have these really emotional poses, which I think are so unlike Diego Rivera, and the scale of the figures. Someone pointed out that in the Portrait of Mexico Today by Siqueiros, that his figures are so much larger scaled and they're not crowded. The canvases aren't crowded. And I love the emotional quality to his poses, and to, it's very imaginative. I think you probably can see the role of spray paint, and he's creating these smooth transitions of color. That guy on the left in the blue shirt is definitely having a moment of sort of artistic transcendence, while the lady takes a selfie there next to him. I love the. I'd like to see an artist do a photographer do. I think some have, but more. I'd like to see more photographers doing paintings, big photographs of the audience, of people in front of paintings. It's really fun to add that layer of anthropology to it. Any comments on this? It's really powerful, and it kind of speaks for itself. Let's keep going. So World War II ends, and this is exciting because we haven't really reached this. We're trailblazing new political turf here with the end of World War II, because we don't see too much of Rivera. She had to keep painting at Rivera and Orozco after this period, but I think the MoMA exhibit really is the peak moment of cross-pollination with the United States. And they continue, the other artists, Mexican muralists, continue having careers, but Siqueiros is still earlier on in his career. And so you have to really kind of bridge the gap from World War II to the Cold War and see how Siqueiros fits into that. Here is, I think, the Japanese emperor or the head of the armed forces surrendering to the United States on board one of the ships, probably in the Pacific. Remember, World War II ends to a degree with the defeat of Hitler, but then after that you have the continuing of the Pacific theater of war against Japan, and this is a major, the major a major part of the Cold War, the importance of nuclear weapons, this new technological invention that can destroy more efficiently and effectively at a greater scale than ever before. And I think we today still live under the specter of sort of humankind with the ability to destroy ourselves more effectively and efficiently than ever. But of course, during the Cold War, especially, people lived under this threat of World War III. And this is something you have to factor into the Cold War in a very important way, this threat of nuclear annihilation because of these warring sides, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now that I look at it, it almost looks like a Disney cartoon. There's like a face in the nuclear cloud there. So I feel like this might be an artist making. It looks too much like a Disney cartoon face to just be an accident. I don't know if you see that too, like a nose and a mouth and a chin and two eyeballs. I don't know. You know, Disney, Mickey Mouse enters public domain, as in, yeah, I think you could do anything you want to Mickey Mouse, and very, very soon, I think this year, because after a certain time period, the copyright on a certain maybe icon or caricature is now enters just public domain, and you can use it. So I think Mickey Mouse will very soon enter public domain. And yeah, you can do whatever you want to Mickey Mouse. So what's the Cold War? Well, a key part of that, of course, is nuclear war, but it's really the United States and the Soviet Union facing off after World War II, after defeating Hitler. The idea was the United States, England, and the Soviet Union agreed not to make a separate peace with with Hitler or Germany, and to demand unconditional surrender by Germany, so that they're all on the same page about that. And once World War II is over, that the obligation to be on the same page is no more. And if anything, it's really the United States and the Soviet Union trying to create some balance in the rest of the world, especially over the formerly colonized former colonies of the British Empire. So Britain's kind of glory days start to fade, and the United States and the Soviet Union start this what's called the Cold War, because there's never any World War III, and there's no declaration of war like in World War II, but it is probably as bloody or as toxic, because it's really an extended war that lasts kind of from 1945 all the way to maybe 2000 or 1989 with the fall of the Soviet Union, early 90s. And that means all kinds of proxy wars or smaller police actions, like in Vietnam or in Africa. And in some places, you know, maybe it's good for the local populations, but I think generally it's bad because we're talking about these two foreign powers fighting over your own sovereignty and trying to make sure your country becomes capitalist or communist. And as you know, Cuba takes the communist path. A lot of Latin America maybe finds some blend of communism and capitalism. But that is something that continues today, the sort of finding that balance between the forces of capitalism, the forces of protecting the weakest and most vulnerable parts of society from just sort of being oppressed. And this is the map of the British Empire at the probably peak of the British Empire, late 1700s, early 1800s, and it shrinks and disintegrates until this is really all that you have at the end of World War II. And so again, this is all these newly independent nations, India, and places in Latin America, Africa, Asia. This is kind of the stage for the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, the determining the destiny of all these newly independent countries. Are they communists? Are they capitalists? And do you even want these other countries involved in your political affairs? So here's Diego Rivera and Leon Trotsky, presumably burying the hatchet. And there's Dr. Adel in the background. So, I don't know if Rivera and Siqueiros had a falling out. That guy in the very back in the middle seems to know something I don't know. But I'd like to look more into that. So Rivera paints this wonderful mural about Mexican history and his own place in this sort of parade of Mexican history. And you might compare this. This is a very important later painting later in the career of Rivera, and compare that to something like this that Siqueiros is painting in the same year Sorry about the quality. Need to find a better slide, but I think this is very much better, more well known in Mexico and Latin America, this painting, than it is in the United States. And I want to ask you, what do you think's going on? And I think he's maybe talking about Mexico, Mexican identity, perhaps, where he says nuestra imagen actual, which is our image now, our image today, in the present moment. What do you think this picture's, what's the message here? Is this related to the end of World War II and the Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War? It's hard for me to figure it out too. In some, no face, hands kind of offering. I'm not sure. It might be something related to Latin America. Possibly, maybe something worth investigating to write about for a paper. Here's another example of his work from the early 50s, and I think you appreciate how he continues to experiment and explore what you can do with murals. Here, it looks like he's using relief, so sculpture, almost treating the wall as putting the figures into relief. And maybe they're doing something kind of workers, teachers. It certainly is a beautiful mural, and it doesn't have all that crowding of figures. And you could see him experimenting with the use of murals and pushing the boundaries. Now it starts to shift into kind of, now we're almost in full swing abstract expressionism in the United States. And I think Siqueiros remains extremely relevant in Mexico and especially in Latin America, but perhaps not so much in the United States, where one of his former students or workshop attendees, Jackson Pollock, makes great headway with abstract expressionism and experimenting with painting at a large scale. And we'll look at abstract expressionism on its own as we bridge into Cuba, so you can understand sort of it on its own, but see it in terms of the possible references, influences from the Mexican muralists and muralism as a whole. So he's very involved politically in student movements. He gets arrested again. I think he has no problem being in jail. What a great mugshot. And he is, I guess, welcome back into Mexico. He's pardoned for his past criminality, and he's commissioned to make, I think, one of his best murals here in this famous castle of Chapultepec here in Mexico City, in that famous park. We've seen this before when the United States sends troops in Mexico City. Definitely a place to add on to your journey to Mexico. If you definitely visit this building and see this great mural, which is really addressing the Porfiriato, this era of Mexican Revolution. So it's to be another chance for us to revisit the Mexican Revolution and to see how muralism processes the revolution. And in this case, I think earlier I said Cananea. It's Cananea strike that the United States plays a big role in suppressing, because it's American-owned mine with American-owned amenities surrounding the mine. And the United States plays a role in probably encouraging the Mexican government to suppress the strike. And this is widely considered the cradle of the Mexican Revolution, because this is Mexicans outraged about foreign interference, foreign involvement, benefiting foreigners at the expense of Mexico, which is very characteristic of the Porfiriato, the many 30-year-long regime of Porfirio Diaz, where he tries to modernize Mexico by selling it off to Americans and other foreign owners. So here he is in full artistic work, at work. And here's the mural he makes. And this will be sort of the last mural we focus on with Siqueiros. So here's a wide shot to show you. I think that gives you a sense of the color and how they really have the space really exclusively for him. And it wraps around, you could see that wraps around this room in a very unique way that we haven't seen before. So let's start here by maybe revisiting us, figuring out what's he doing with Mexico City? How is he, I'm not Mexico City, the Mexican Revolution. It seems to be chronological, or it could be chronological. What do you think is the major, what's he doing visually here with this part of the painting? What do you think is going on here? You can see it shifts to what looks like a Zapata-like Mexican revolutionary, perhaps. So this could be like Orozco's mural, sort of chronological visualization of history moving from forward to the past to the future. So I think you could safely assume this is maybe the setting leading up to the Mexican Revolution, perhaps. Figures lying down, or you think of death, or how it equalizes everybody. I think I tend to want to see this as more equalizing everyone. But the main thing I notice is everyone's like flat, like these pieces of landscape. So it's almost like connecting the physical body of Mexicans to the landscape. I'm not totally sure, but that's my first reaction. Anyone else have any idea about that? Feels like a road, something, a path, maybe a bloody path you're walking on. Yes, Emmy.
It kind of reminds me of like dominoes, like stacked one after the other, kind of like the domino effect of like war and like one action leading to another, and then going into the sunset sort of makes it feel almost like transcendent, like in a way that, like resurrection, or not resurrection, like death and rebirth kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. I like that people kind of maybe somehow have make a comment about how whatever before the revolution, or things leading, like kind of this history of pain it clearly reaches the last domino here, right? And this must be the last, we the viewers, like the last domino. Maybe it's like a way of saying you could fall down and be the next domino or not. I like that. And I also really like what you're pointing out, the emotional kind of quality of the sunset, adding a set layer of meaning, maybe beginning of the journey, or maybe that's the sort of where it's leading to. And I think there's many different ways of interpreting. These are maybe the fallen dead, the dominoes that are fertilizing the present day, acknowledging the people who, it looks like there's some blood and some kind of like they're perhaps fallen, like dominoes, like you said. So yeah, that's great. And again, him using a lot of imagination, and repeating these forms is something I see really powerful about his work. It seemed to shift from left to right with this cowboy kind of campesino revolutionary. You don't see a lot of that blue and the red. It's really more the red here. So, that's maybe just his work evolving. It almost reminds me of America Tropical, with like the tree like visual forms connecting these scenes together. Now it wraps around, and of the videos I've seen of this, it's hard to get a little view of that. Of course, most of the photographers ignore that little lip there on the left and they go right to here. So I can't tell you for sure. It looks like it kind of abstracts into just sort of an abstract shape on the left. But I noticed immediately, I have like Rivera-like use of crowding lots of figures, but the vantage point, we're like up above looking down. So that's an interesting thing to consider, just why, what benefits, how that benefits the mural, having us placed higher above. Kind of an echo of Zapata here, or the Orozco mural here, but with these sort of repeating figures. But again, it's a different sort of, I feel almost like, it's Rivera like the crowding, but we have a higher angle, so it almost feels like a real use of space with like an army of people. But there's also almost something cookie cutter like too, which is fun. Even the ammunition belts around their chest look like kind of cookie cutter. And yeah, there's something, and maybe even a stencil too. I don't know, but I think there's something unique about Siqueiros, which isn't trying to replicate Orozco or trying to copy Rivera, but contribute something unique. And this is a story of the Porfiriato, so this would be, of course, people rising up, probably the Cananea mine workers, maybe rising up against the mine owner, and then being oppressed by the Mexican forces who sort of more subservient to American interests. But there's a lot of emotion still, more emotion and dynamism than in Diego Rivera. What do you think? What's going on here? Looks like they're fighting over the flag, which is a very wonderful metaphor. Great visual. Give me the flag. So I presume maybe it's like powerful forces of the Porfiriato, the Porfirio Diaz regime versus perhaps the everyday Mexican worker or laborer competing for possession of the flag. That's a really powerful way of describing the Mexican Revolution, sort of controlling the flag as control of the country. And the people look like they're watching with awe. And anyone have any comments here? Yeah, I think this is probably exactly the, capturing the mine, the strike at Cananea, and maybe illustrating that as a key part of this, the cradle of the Mexican Revolution. And it sort of drifts into what we see here. And who is this? Who do you think we're looking at here? And what do you think he's standing on? He's not standing, but his left foot has one foot on top of this book. Yes, a politician. And I think this is probably Porfirio Diaz. We don't see him wearing all the medals that are so recognizably.
Oh, sorry. Maybe he's on top of the Constitution.
Pardon me? Oh, the Constitution, like that's the Constitution down below.
Yeah, I think so. It could be.
Yeah, interesting. That could be a book of laws, standing on the laws. Yeah, I think that's probably a good reading of it. What are those people doing around him? Is that Daniela?
Yeah.
What do you think those people around him are? What are they saying to him?
Honestly, they're probably just like supporting him, even, and like being like, "Hey, I'm here with you," so in the future they can ask for favors and gain something from being there.
Yeah, he also, he famously was surrounded by these guys called the científicos, who are sort of these expert kind of bureaucrats. So this could be a visualization of that sort of echo chamber. Porfirio Diaz was in power for many decades, so probably he delegated a lot of power to these middlemen, middle people who probably did whatever they want and told Porfirio Diaz, whatever they wanted to tell him. And that probably happens a lot with presidents, with powerful people, with the rich they get so isolated from the average person, you might lose touch with reality, or if you spend a lot of time online. But I love, it's every time I reach a point where I'm kind of wondering about what I love about Siqueiros, he reminds me of just such a rich, he's such a wonderful painter. You see some of those sort of roots in satire and cartoon, maybe even some Orozco here. But definitely not the same as Rivera Orozco. The more abstract elements. This kind of reminds me of, got that red and kind of stale, not stale, but kind of slate gray quality of Orozco's paintings. Got a little video camera making sure no one touches the mural. And here we kind of drift around from that right side. So, I wonder if they added those walls because they wanted the mural to have this sort of entryway into that kind of more private chamber there. Really interesting use of this weird kind of not obstruction, but intrusion into the room. And this mural really, there's not too much more there at the end. He continues with these sort of huge scale, ambitious murals, but it kind of drifts into more of an abstract kind of. For me, this isn't as clear, and though it's beautiful and ambitious, it shows his experimentation. Kind of drifting into what I would call very dated 1970s look. This one is a little too busy for me, and a little, maybe he's just, wanting to, do stuff that's challenging for him. You can see how big it is. Look at those chairs on the left, just how this is enormous. So perhaps it's the failings of the picture to capture the enormity and the scale. But I don't think that's it for me personally. I just think it kind of drifts into this sort of 1970s kind of quality of paint that for me just feels a little dated. With this being definitely an exception, the exterior feels still really wonderful and powerful. And I didn't just look, he's creating these murals site specifically for this building. I think this is called, the Polyforum in Mexico City, probably. But I personally wouldn't add this to my list of places I would definitely go to see personally, just because I like some of the other murals a little more. And perhaps this is maybe why I don't like Siqueiros as much. I don't know, Milton, how you feel, but for me, this is kind of just as a different kind of 1970s quality to it. And maybe I'm just biased because I tend to like look at maybe abstract expressionism, or maybe the art world shifts into performance, and video art and pop art. And I think he's still trying to make muralism intelligible and kind of relatable to the average Mexican, and still trying to tackle politics. And in this very interesting period of art, in this flux between maybe World War II and coping with fascism, and abstract expressionism becomes a major form of art in the world as like America's contribution, United States contribution to the art world. And it's very free from politics, as we've talked about, maybe by definition, by deliberation, by deliberately so, because the art world doesn't want to maybe politicize art anymore. It's just maybe everyone done with politics. It's just World War II is over. They need like an exhalation. But I think you could also see that as a response to the fact that Hitler forced a lot of artists to exile, to leave Europe under threat of maybe going to the concentration camps. And these artists fertilized American artists with abstraction. So the recipe for abstract expressionism in New York is kind of these immigrant artists from Europe, but also these Mexican muralists who I think add the scale and grandeur of muralism. Because Jackson Pollock isn't considered a muralist. None of the abstract expressionist artists, well, maybe there's a few exceptions, but as a rule, they're not considered muralists because they're painting on really big canvases. But I think they're painting on really big canvases because the Mexican muralists inspire them to make big scale, something big scale. Because if you want it to be from the United States or something new world, it's got to be big. Maybe that's because of industry. Maybe that's because of all the space. I think it has something to do with maybe like the billboard quality of getting people's attention in the United States. Or maybe it just comes from the fact that Mexican muralism was tackling big scale subjects that require large scale because it's meant to be in public and seen. And that is sort of just an inadvertent reason why abstract expressionism is so big scale. But it's not just the scale, it's also this expressionism and the abstract part. But I think, and we'll talk about this another day, I think historians, artist historians tend to focus on the abstract part of abstract expressionism, not so much on the expressionism start, not so much on the expressionism part, and definitely not so much on the importance of scale, because it's easy to ignore scale as just something, it's big, but you have to really see that as we've seen throughout this kind of series of muralists, how scale shifts the sort of one-on-one quality of a mural. And perhaps preserving a sense of emotion is a real challenge, and preserving a sense of connection to the viewer on a large scale is the sort of is the challenge of abstract expressionism. And people like Pollock might be sort of responding to the emotional quality of a Roscoe, but trying to take that emotional quality, making it relevant and meaningful, or relevant to the United States and the art world as a whole, at a large scale, but without relying on Picasso and the figure as a sort of recognizable part of art, or something recognizable in this traditional sense. So in that sense, the abstract expressionism is definitely veering very quickly away from anything figurative, anything kind of recognizable. And that really has to be understood in terms of World War II ending, these artists from Europe going to the United States. In fact, an artist like Mark Rothko, an abstract expressionist, he famously said that after World War II, he, and I'm paraphrasing and butchering his quote, he couldn't paint the figure without mutilating it, which I think was just like a reaction to collective trauma of the Holocaust. Maybe painting figures felt just something like that was out of step with maybe the trauma. Maybe abstraction was a sanctuary, a retreat from the political radioactive politics of World War II. Of course, politics gets only more radioactive, literally, with the specter of a mushroom cloud. You can see that woman with her arms up, kind of like Lady Liberty. And this is the guy I was referring to, why the eagle could be a symbol of Aztec or United States, because Cuauhtemoc was a last leader of the Aztecs. And his name, literally, if I remember, is fallen eagle or descended eagle. I can't remember. I thought I had that written here, but yeah, I know his name is connected to the idea of the eagle as sort of a totemic animal. So we do see art after World War II in the United States get away from muralism, as far as it's no longer satisfying the needs of the work progress administration to put out of work artists into jobs and to paint the story of the United States as it collects the pieces, broken pieces of the country and puts them together after the Great Depression, and puts some sort of focuses them on fighting Hitler and defeating fascism. So, as that's just one final note, this cross pollination with the United States, this is a major part of that. The Orozco bomber and tank, especially in terms of the scale, it's large scale, and we already saw that Pollock was very much inspired by Orozco. And I think this too is a really major part of this cross pollination, both in terms of abstraction, expressionism, and inspiring Pollock to break out of the mold of painting into more kind of expressionism and performance, as not necessarily intentionally, but the performative act of making art as a recording of the artist dancing around the canvas and performing the work of art, and not just focusing on the final product. And again, that blue and red is such a fascinating part of the story, and this workshop as a literal moment of cross-pollination between the likes of Jackson Pollock and Siqueiros. So here he is, and I think you can appreciate his sort of powerful political contribution to muralism, but also as sort of a guerrilla figure on the ground. And he, again, is a really important anticipation for Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution. And I think and I'd like to know more again about when he was in Cuba, if he spent time with Wilfredo Lam, the Cuban artist who had spent a lot of time in Paris. And I wouldn't be surprised if he had met Wilfredo Lam in Paris. And so I'll do a little research on that and find out if I can connect those dots. But you will see in Cuba that there is no Mexican muralism in Cuba. There's some brief efforts at it, but I think you'll find that the Cuban Revolution takes place too long after or out of step with the Mexican Revolution. And that means that muralism isn't quite the language of revolution that we see in Mexico. And Cuba adopts more of a kind of, well, maybe Soviet influenced form of art that's the sort of medium of the revolution, but we'll tackle that a later day. So any questions about Siqueiros? I will post the guidelines for your final paper today or tomorrow, and certainly Siqueiros is someone to consider writing about. Maybe even if you want to do more of a kind of if your paper wants to focus more on something just that you want to do, I'm happy to work with whatever you want, because I think what matters is for you to write about something that's engaging for you and maybe answer some questions that you have about this, maybe historical, biographical, or maybe even focuses on just the idea of cross-pollination and how some of the artists we've seen have influenced American artists, including someone like Frida Kahlo, how she's not as clearly someone who has this literal cross-pollination with, between like Siqueiros and Jackson Pollock, but I think her influence is bigger and deeper and maybe more invisible, and it might be a matter of just revealing that to everyone, to all of us. So questions, comments? You won't have any homework, just make sure and I'll post your reading about Cuba this week. And I know I have a lot of grading to catch up with. I'm sorry, I'll have your midterms graded by next week. But definitely send me any mural contributions you want for your anything you make for your mural project, so we can look at them next Thursday. I think we'll do that at the beginning of class next Thursday. And let me know if you don't want me to share anything you submit with the rest of class. Any questions? Any comments? Anyone? Milton, do you like Siqueiros still the same way?
I really love his art. Like it looks really powerful. Like
Yeah,
the paint is really strong, and the color used. Like he's really good at using colors.
Yeah, do you like Siqueiros or Orozco? Who do you like more, Thea? Orozco or Siqueiros?
Skittles.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Yeah, dynamic. I think his dynamism, Aggie mentions, it's dynamic, very dynamic.
Yeah.
Let me stop the recording so we can get you on to share anything.